The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. The dirt road stretched endlessly ahead, framed by towering trees on either side. The car's engine hummed steadily, a comforting sound against the otherwise oppressive silence. I glanced at the fuel gauge. The needle was dangerously close to E. I cursed under my breath, regretting my decision to take the back roads instead of sticking to the highway. It had seemed like a good idea earlier in the day. Avoid traffic, take in the scenery, save a little time. But now, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road, the isolation felt less charming and more unsettling. No other cars had passed me for hours. I checked my phone again, but the no service icon mocked me from the corner of the screen. Ahead, the road curved sharply. As I rounded the bend, I spotted a wooden sign half hidden by overgrown bushes. Maple Hollow, 2 miles. Relief flooded through me. A town, even a small one, meant gas, food, and maybe a chance to stretch my legs. I pressed the accelerator slightly, eager to make it there before nightfall. The road narrowed further as I drove, the trees closing in until their branches seemed to form a canopy overhead. Dappled sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting shifting patterns on the dirt road. It was beautiful in a way, but it also made me feel like I was being swallowed whole by the forest. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. When I finally reached Maple Hollow, it was smaller than I'd expected. Much smaller. A cluster of weathered buildings lined the single street, their paint peeling and windows clouded with grime. There was a gas station, though, and that was all I cared about. I pulled up to the pump, shut off the engine, and stepped out of the car. The air was cooler than I'd anticipated, with a faint chill that hinted at the coming night. The station looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The pumps were old-fashioned, with analog dials instead of digital screens. A bell jingled faintly as I stepped into the small convenience store attached to the station. The interior smelled of stale cigarettes and something metallic. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet space. No response. The counter was empty, though a half-empty coffee cup sat next to an ancient-looking cash register. I rang the little silver bell on the counter and waited. Still nothing. The longer I stood there, the more aware I became of the silence. No hum of refrigeration units, no distant chatter, no background music. Just nothing. I decided to pump the gas first and sort out payment later. As I walked back to my car, I noticed the faint crunch of gravel beneath my feet. It seemed louder than it should have, like the quiet of the town was amplifying every sound. I filled up the tank quickly, my eyes darting around the empty street. There were no cars parked anywhere, no people walking around. The whole place felt abandoned. Once the tank was full, I went back inside to leave some cash on the counter. That's when I noticed the note. It was taped to the register, written in uneven block letters. "Take what you need and leave. Do not stay after dark." My stomach dropped. I stared at the note, trying to make sense of it. Was it some kind of joke? A warning? My eyes darted to the coffee cup again. It was still warm, faint wisps of steam curling up from the surface. Someone had been here recently. I called out again, louder this time. "Hello? Is anyone here?" No answer. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. I left the cash on the counter and hurried back to my car. I wanted to get out of this place as fast as possible. As I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, I glanced at the dashboard clock. 5:47 p.m. The sun was already sinking below the treetops, casting the town in deepening shadows. I pulled back onto the road, heading out of Maple Hollow. The trees loomed closer than ever, their branches almost brushing the sides of the car. The further I drove, the darker it got. The narrow road twisted and turned, the dense forest blocking out what little light remained. My headlights carved a path through the darkness, illuminating the dirt road and the occasional reflective eyes of small animals darting across it. Then the engine sputtered. "No, no, no," I muttered, my grip tightening on the wheel. The car lurched forward a few more feet before the engine died completely. I coasted to a stop, the headlights dimming until I was left in near total darkness. Panic bubbled up in my chest. I tried the ignition again, but the engine only groaned in protest. I grabbed my phone, hoping for a miracle, but the screen still displayed no service. I was miles from Maple Hollow now, deep in the middle of nowhere. My heart pounded as I considered my options. I could stay in the car and wait for help, though the chances of someone passing by seemed slim. Or I could try to walk back to the town, though the idea of trekking through the forest at night sent a shiver down my spine. I decided to stay put. At least the car offered some semblance of safety. I locked the doors and leaned back in the seat, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The darkness outside the windows was absolute, pressing in on all sides. Every now and then, I thought I heard something. A faint rustling, a distant snap of a branch. I told myself it was just animals, the normal sounds of the forest at night. But then there was a knock. It was soft, almost tentative, but unmistakable. A single, deliberate tap on the driver's side window. My blood ran cold. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head to look. There was nothing there, just darkness. Another knock, this time on the rear window. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't see anything, but the sound was clear, deliberate. Someone or something was out there. I fumbled for the flashlight I kept in the glove compartment, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. When I finally managed to turn it on, the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees outside. The forest was still silent. Nothing moved, no sign of anyone. I sat there, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the knocks. Maybe it was just the car settling, or an animal brushing against the window. But deep down, I knew better. Then I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible movement in the trees. Something pale, low to the ground, darting between the trunks. My breath hitched. I aimed the flashlight towards it, but whatever it was disappeared before the beam could catch it. My mind raced. A coyote? A deer? No, it had moved too fast, too deliberately. I didn't wait to find out. I tried the ignition again, desperation overriding logic. The engine sputtered weakly, then roared to life. Relief surged through me as I threw the car into gear and sped down the road. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from here. The road seemed endless, the darkness pressing in on all sides. My eyes darted between the windshield and the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, anything, chasing me. But the road behind remained empty. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint glow in the distance. Streetlights. I burst out of the forest onto a paved highway, my tires screeching as they hit the asphalt. Civilization. Safety. I didn't stop until I reached a brightly lit gas station miles down the road. I parked under the harsh fluorescent lights, my hands still trembling as I cut the engine. Inside, the cashier gave me a strange look as I stumbled in, disheveled and wide-eyed. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure it was true. "Just had some car trouble," I mumbled. I stayed there for a while, sipping bad coffee and letting the harsh light and background noise soothe my nerves. I didn't tell anyone about the knocks or the movement in the trees. I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. But as I got back on the road, heading for home, one thought lingered in my mind. I should have listened to the note. I was halfway through my cross-country road trip when I found myself on an isolated stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. The road stretched ahead endlessly, flanked by nothing but flat, barren land as far as the eye could see. The sun was setting, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, but the beauty of it was lost on me. I was running low on gas, and there hadn't been a service station or a single sign of civilization for miles. My phone had no signal, and I was beginning to feel the creeping unease that comes with being utterly alone. I cursed myself for not filling up earlier when I had the chance. The last town I passed through was hours ago. A blink-and-you'll-miss-it place with a single diner and a gas pump that looked like it hadn't been used since the 60s. I had waved it off, confident that I'd find a bigger station up ahead. Now, I was regretting that decision with every mile I drove. The car's gas gauge dipped into the red zone, and I knew I couldn't keep going much longer. I scanned the horizon for any sign of life, but all I saw was the endless, empty expanse of dirt and scrub. The road was eerily quiet. I hadn't seen another car in hours. It was as if I was the only person left in the world. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, plunging the landscape into darkness, I spotted something in the distance. At first, I thought it was a mirage, a trick of my desperate mind, but as I got closer, I saw it was a building. It looked like an old gas station, its faded sign barely legible in the dim light. Relief flooded through me, and I pulled in, my tires crunching on the gravel. The place was a relic from another era, with peeling paint and a single rusty pump. A flickering neon light buzzed above the door, casting an eerie glow over the entrance. The windows were dark, and I couldn't tell if anyone was inside. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the silence. The only sound was the ticking of my car's cooling engine. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. The stillness was unnerving. The station was surrounded by nothing but open land, and the vastness of it made me feel exposed. I walked to the door and pushed it open, the creak of the hinges echoing in the empty space. Inside, the place was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The shelves were mostly empty, lined with dusty cans and faded boxes of snacks. A counter stood at the far end, with an old cash register and a bell that looked like it hadn't been rung in years. There was no sign of anyone. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. No answer. I rang the bell, the sharp ding making me flinch. Still nothing. I looked around, feeling a growing sense of unease. There was a door behind the counter, slightly ajar, leading to what I assumed was a back room. I hesitated. Something about this place didn't feel right, but I didn't have much choice. I needed gas, and this was my only option. I walked back outside to check the pump. It was one of those old, manual ones with a crank. There was no card reader, just a faded sign that said, "Pay inside." I tried the nozzle, but nothing happened. The pump was dry. Frustration bubbled up inside me, and I slammed the nozzle back into its holder. Now what? As I stood there, trying to figure out my next move, I heard a noise. It was faint, barely audible over the silence, but it was there. A soft shuffling sound, like someone moving around inside the station. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe there was someone here after all. Maybe they could help me. I went back inside, the door creaking again as I pushed it open. "Hello," I called out, louder this time. The shuffling sound stopped. I walked to the counter and peered into the back room. It was dark, but I could make out the outline of shelves and boxes. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm out of gas. Is there anyone here?" Still no answer. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight. I stepped closer to the door, trying to see if there was anyone in the shadows. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, but as I got closer, it grew stronger. A sickly, metallic odor that made my stomach turn. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open wider. The back room was a mess, cluttered with broken furniture and piles of junk. In the corner, I saw what looked like a sleeping bag, crumpled and stained. Next to it was a pile of empty cans and food wrappers. Someone had been living here recently. The smell was stronger now, almost overwhelming. I covered my nose with my sleeve, my eyes scanning the room for the source. And then I saw it, a dark stain on the floor, spreading out from beneath the sleeping bag. My mind struggled to process what I was looking at, but deep down I knew. It was blood, a lot of it. Panic set in. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I needed to get out of here. I turned and bolted for the door, my footsteps echoing in the empty station. As I reached the exit, I heard the shuffling sound again, louder this time. It was coming from outside, near my car. I froze, my hand on the door. My car was my only way out, but if someone was out there, I didn't want to think about what that meant. I peeked through the window, trying to see if I could spot anything. The darkness outside was almost complete, but the faint light from the neon sign illuminated the area around my car. That's when I saw the figure. A man standing near the driver's side door, his back to me. He was tall and thin, wearing a tattered jacket and jeans. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at my car. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know if he had seen me, but I wasn't about to wait and find out. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I needed to think. I couldn't stay here, but I couldn't just walk up to my car with him standing there. I looked around the station for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing, just empty shelves and broken furniture. The man outside moved, turning slightly as if he was looking around. I ducked down behind the counter, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't see him anymore, but I could hear his footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. He was moving, circling the car. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I needed to get to the car. If I could just make it inside and lock the doors, I might have a chance. I waited, listening to the sound of his footsteps. When they moved to the far side of the car, I made my move. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and sprinting towards the car. The man saw me, his head snapping up as I ran. He shouted something, but I didn't stop to listen. I yanked the driver's side door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut and locking it in one motion. He was on me in seconds, pounding on the window with his fists. His face was contorted with rage, his eyes wild. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life and I slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, throwing him off balance. He stumbled back, and I took the opportunity to speed away, the tires kicking up gravel as I peeled out of the station. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there watching me go. His figure grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the darkness. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. An hour later, I pulled into a brightly lit gas station and parked near the pumps, my hands still trembling. I told the attendant what had happened, and they called the police. I gave my statement, describing the man and the gas station as best as I could. A few days later, I got a call from the authorities. They had investigated the station but found no sign of the man. The back room was exactly as I had described, bloodstains and all, but there were no bodies, no evidence of who the blood belonged to. They told me the station had been abandoned for years, a relic of a bygone era. Whoever the man was, he was long gone. To this day, I don't know what happened at that gas station or who the man was, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes as he pounded on my window, or the suffocating silence of that desolate stretch of highway. It was a reminder that sometimes, the scariest things in life aren't ghosts or monsters, but the darkness that exists in the hearts of men. I'm not sure what drew me to the backroads that day. Maybe it was the promise of a shortcut or just my stubborn need to avoid the crowded highways. Whatever the reason, I found myself in the middle of nowhere, driving along a 2-lane road that cut through miles of barren fields and dense woods. The GPS had lost signal about an hour ago, and I was relying on a printed map that felt like a relic from another time. The road was cracked, weeds poking through the asphalt, and there wasn't a single house or car in sight. It was just me, my old sedan, and the endless expanse of emptiness. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the road. I hadn't seen another vehicle for hours, and the isolation was beginning to gnaw at me. I kept telling myself that I'd reach a town soon, but the miles dragged on, and the road just seemed to stretch further into nowhere. My fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty. I cursed myself for not filling up at the last gas station, but it had been miles ago, and I hadn't thought it would be an issue. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, I spotted a faint glimmer of light ahead. It was small, maybe just a reflection, but it was enough to spark a sliver of hope. I pressed on, the tires humming on the rough pavement. The light grew brighter as I approached, revealing an old, dilapidated gas station. The sign above the building was weathered and illegible, and the single pump looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Still, it was something. I pulled up next to the pump and stepped out of the car. The air was cold and smelled faintly of damp earth. The station's windows were dark, and there was no sign of anyone inside. A single bulb hung above the door, flickering weakly. I tried the pump, but nothing happened. No gas, no noise, just the hollow clunk of a machine long out of service. Frustrated, I walked toward the door of the station. The wooden boards creaked under my weight as I stepped onto the porch. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I tried the handle and it opened with a groan. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. Shelves lined the walls, but they were mostly empty, save for a few rusted cans and faded boxes. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the small space. No response. I debated whether to look around more or head back to the car. The idea of spending the night in the car didn't sit well with me, especially in a place like this. I decided to search for anything that might help. Phone, a map, anything. I moved cautiously through the station, the floorboards creaking with each step. In the back corner, I spotted an old payphone. My heart leapt as I rushed over, but the receiver was gone, and the wires had been ripped out. Useless. As I turned to leave, I noticed a door behind the counter. It was slightly ajar, revealing a staircase leading downward. A faint smell wafted up from the darkness, a mix of damp concrete and something metallic. Curiosity wrestled with caution. I told myself it wasn't worth it, but something about the open door felt like an invitation I couldn't ignore. I descended the stairs slowly, the weak light from above barely illuminating the steps. The air grew colder with each step, and my breathing sounded loud in the confined space. At the bottom, I found myself in a small concrete room. There was a table in the center with various tools scattered across it. Wrenches, screwdrivers, and a hammer stained with something dark. Against the far wall was a row of shelves filled with jars. I stepped closer and immediately regretted it. The jars contained what looked like preserved animals, their distorted forms floating in a murky liquid. A shiver ran down my spine. I turned to leave, but a sound stopped me. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like the scrape of something against concrete. I froze, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. My heart pounded as I realized it was coming from the staircase. I bolted for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. As I reached the top, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. I leaned against the counter, trying to catch my breath. The station was silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I ran back to my car and turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered but didn't start. I tried again, but the same thing happened. Panic set in as I realized I was stranded. I grabbed my phone, but there was still no signal. I looked around, desperate for any sign of help. That's when I noticed the faint glow of a fire in the distance. It was coming from a small clearing just beyond the station. With no other options, I decided to investigate. I grabbed the flashlight from my glove compartment and started walking toward the light. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound being the crunch of gravel under my boots. As I got closer, I saw that the fire was in a metal drum, surrounded by a few folding chairs. The chairs were empty, but the fire was still burning, as if someone had just been there. I called out, but there was no response. I looked around, shining my flashlight into the surrounding woods. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I saw were trees and shadows. I turned back to the fire and noticed something on the ground near the chairs. It was a notebook partially burned at the edges. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. Most of the writing was illegible, but one word stood out, scrawled over and over, "Run." My stomach dropped. I turned back toward the gas station, intending to get back to my car, but I froze in my tracks. Standing in the doorway of the station was a figure. It was too dark to make out any details, but they were tall and unmoving. My flashlight beam wavered as my hand trembled. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I took a step back, then another, until I was sure I could make a run for it. I turned and sprinted toward the woods. Branches whipped against my face, and the uneven ground threatened to trip me with every step. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, driven by pure adrenaline and fear. Eventually, I stumbled into a small clearing. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like jelly. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. As I sat there, trying to gather my thoughts, I realized I could hear water, a faint trickle like a stream or a creek. I followed the sound, hoping it might lead me to a road or a house. The stream was shallow, but it wound through the woods like a natural path. I followed it for what felt like hours, my flashlight growing dimmer with each passing minute. Just as the flashlight flickered out completely, I saw a structure in the distance. It was a small cabin, its windows glowing with warm light. Relief washed over me as I approached. I knocked on the door, my knuckles raw and trembling. After a moment, the door creaked open, and an older man stood there, his face lined with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice steady and calm. I nodded, unable to find the words. He ushered me inside and offered me a chair by the fire. The warmth was a welcome relief, and I began to explain what had happened. The man listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You're lucky you made it out of there," he said. "That place has been abandoned for years. People say strange things happen out there, but no one really knows for sure." I stayed at the cabin until morning, when the man offered to drive me to the nearest town. As we drove away, I couldn't help but look back at the woods. They seemed calm and ordinary in the daylight, but I knew better. Whatever had happened out there, it was real, and I'd carry it with me for the rest of my life. I'll never forget the day I decided to take the back roads. It was one of those rash decisions you make when you're fed up with the mundane and looking for some kind of adventure, though I wasn't exactly expecting the kind I got. I'd been driving cross-country for hours, trying to make my way back home after a family visit that stretched too long. I'd promised myself I'd avoid highways this time, just to see more of the country. A few hours into the trip, I found myself on a narrow, two-lane road that didn't even show up on my GPS. That should have been the first warning sign, but I was too stubborn to turn back. The road was bordered by thick woods on both sides, tall pines and oaks casting long shadows in the late afternoon light. Every so often, The trees would part just enough to reveal rolling fields or the occasional dilapidated barn. I kept driving, confident that the road would eventually lead to a main route. But the miles stretched on, and the road seemed to grow narrower, winding deeper into what felt like the middle of nowhere. The first real sign of trouble came when I noticed my gas gauge dipping dangerously close to empty. I cursed myself for not filling up earlier. I hadn't passed a gas station in hours, and there was no sign of civilization anywhere. I told myself I'd find something soon. There had to be a town or at least a house somewhere up ahead. But the road just kept going, the trees closing in tighter, the light fading faster. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was running on fumes. I turned off the AC to conserve gas and cracked a window. The cool evening air carried the scent of damp earth and pine, but it did little to calm my nerves. My phone had lost service hours ago, and I hadn't seen another car in just as long. Then, just as my gas light started blinking, I spotted a small dirt road branching off to the right. There was a rusty metal sign half hidden in the undergrowth, but the lettering was too faded to read. I slowed down, debating whether to take it. The road didn't look promising, but at that point I didn't have much of a choice. I turned onto the dirt path, my tires crunching over gravel and twigs. It was even narrower than the main road, with low-hanging branches that scraped against the roof of my car like skeletal fingers. After about a mile, I saw a faint light through the trees. Relief washed over me. A house, maybe? Or a cabin? I'd take anything at this point. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just one light but several, scattered across what looked like a cluster of small buildings. It wasn't a town exactly, but it was something. I pulled up to what appeared to be a general store. The building was old, the wood weathered and gray, with a sagging roof and a single flickering bulb above the entrance. There were a few other structures nearby, a couple of houses, a barn, and what looked like a workshop, but no cars, no people, no movement. The place felt abandoned, yet the light above the store suggested otherwise. I killed the engine and stepped out, the sound of my door slamming echoing in the stillness. The air was colder now, and the silence was oppressive. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. I walked up to the store, the wooden porch creaking under my weight. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated. Something about the place felt off, but I was desperate. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, with shelves stocked sparsely with canned goods, dusty bottles, and miscellaneous items. A small counter sat at the back, but there was no sign of a cashier. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet space. No answer. I walked up to the counter, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. A bell sat on the counter, so I gave it a tap. The sharp ding rang out, and then silence again. I waited, glancing around the store. There was a strange smell in the air, something metallic and sour. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough to make me uneasy. After a few more minutes of waiting, I decided to look around outside. Maybe whoever ran the place was in one of the nearby buildings. I stepped back onto the porch and scanned the area. The barn was the closest structure, its doors slightly open. I walked over, the gravel crunching under my boots. The barn was dark inside, but I could make out the shapes of tools hanging on the walls and bales of hay stacked in the corner. It didn't look like anyone had been there recently. As I turned to leave, I noticed something glinting in the moonlight near the edge of the barn. I walked over and saw a row of cars parked haphazardly in the grass, partially hidden by the tree line. There were at least 6 or 7 of them, all in varying states of decay. Some had flat tires, others were covered in rust, and a few looked like they'd been there for decades. My stomach sank. Why would there be so many abandoned cars here? I backed away, my pulse quickening. Something about this place wasn't right. I decided to head back to my car and keep driving, gas or no gas. As I walked back toward the store, I noticed a faint sound in the distance, a low, rhythmic thumping. It was faint but unmistakable, like the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. I froze, straining to listen. The sound seemed to be coming from behind one of the houses. Every instinct told me to get back in my car and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept toward the house, keeping to the shadows. The sound grew louder as I approached, and I could make out a faint light coming from one of the windows. I peered around the corner of the house and saw a figure moving in the yard. It was a man, his back to me, dragging what looked like a large, heavy bag across the ground. The bag left a dark trail behind it, and my stomach turned as I realized what it might be. I backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he'd hear it. I made it back to my car, slid into the driver's seat, and turned the key. The engine sputtered but didn't start. "Come on," I whispered, turning the key again. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into reverse, backing out onto the dirt road. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man standing in the middle of the road, watching me. He didn't move, didn't try to stop me. He just stood there, silhouetted against the faint glow of the store's light. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the gas gauge well past empty. Eventually, the road led me to a small town, where I found a gas station and filled up. I told the attendant about the place I'd found, but he just gave me a blank look. "Ain't nothing out that way," he said. "Just woods." I didn't argue. I just paid for my gas and got back on the road, sticking to the highways this time. I've thought about that place a lot since then, about the man and the cars and the dark trail leading from that bag. I don't know what I stumbled into that night, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that I'll never take the back roads again. I don't know what I was thinking, heading out there by myself. The desert highway stretched endlessly in both directions, a ribbon of cracked asphalt baking under the midday sun. It was supposed to be a quick detour, a shortcut on my way to visit an old friend in Nevada. Google Maps had shown it as a pale gray line cutting through the middle of nowhere, saving me an hour or so, I thought. I had no idea it would turn into the longest day of my life. The radio crackled and died about 20 miles back, leaving me alone with the hum of my car's engine and the occasional rattle from loose gravel pinging off the undercarriage. My phone had lost signal almost as soon as I turned off the main highway. The silence felt thick, oppressive, and the heat shimmered in waves off the road. The occasional cactus or dusty shrub broke up the landscape, but otherwise, it was all sand, rock, and sky. The gas gauge hovered just above empty. I knew I should have filled up before I left the last town, but I'd been in a rush, thinking I'd make it to the next stop easily. Stupid. Now I was somewhere between nowhere and nothing, and there hadn't been a single sign of civilization for miles. I scanned the horizon for any hint of a gas station or even a house, but it was just open land, stretching out forever. The car sputtered before I even realized what was happening. I tapped the gas pedal instinctively, as if that would somehow summon fuel from nowhere, but it was no use. The engine coughed one last time before going silent. I coasted to a stop on the side of the road, the sun beating down through the windshield like a furnace. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the empty expanse ahead of me. "Great," I muttered, though the sound of my own voice felt strange in the quiet. I grabbed my phone, hoping against hope that maybe a signal had miraculously appeared. No bars, not even a flicker of hope. Just the mocking little "no service" message glaring up at me. I stepped out of the car, and the heat hit me like a wall. It was dry heat, sure, but that didn't make it any less brutal. I squinted against the glare, scanning the horizon again. Still nothing, just the endless, unforgiving desert. The nearest town had to be at least 50 miles away, probably more. Walking wasn't an option. Not in this heat, not without water. I had half a bottle left in the car, already warm from sitting in the cup holder. It wouldn't last long. I popped the trunk and rummaged around, hoping I'd forgotten about some emergency supplies stashed back there. A blanket, a tire iron, an old road atlas that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics for all the good it would do me. No water, no food, nothing useful. I slammed the trunk shut, the sound echoing eerily in the emptiness. I considered my options. Stay with the car and hope someone came along? Unlikely. I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. Or start walking and risk collapsing from heat stroke before I found help. Neither choice was appealing. I decided to wait for a while, at least until the worst of the midday heat passed. Maybe, just maybe, someone would come by. The hours dragged on. I tried to stay in the shade of the car, but even that offered little relief. The metal burned to the touch, and the air felt like it was searing my lungs. I rationed the water, taking small sips and trying not to think about how fast it was disappearing. The sun inched across the sky, casting long shadows as afternoon turned to evening. Still, no one came. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature began to drop. It wasn't exactly cool, but it was better than the blistering heat of midday. I decided to start walking. Sitting by the car felt like waiting to die, and at least if I was moving, I'd feel like I was doing something. I grabbed the atlas and the water bottle, stuffing them into my backpack along with the blanket. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I stuck to the road, figuring it was my best chance of being found. The asphalt radiated heat even as the sun disappeared below the horizon, but the air cooled rapidly. Soon, it was almost chilly, and I wrapped the blanket around my shoulders as I walked. The stars came out, bright and countless in the clear desert sky. It would have been beautiful if I hadn't been so scared. The night stretched on, and the road seemed endless. I tried to keep track of time, but my phone's battery had died hours ago, and without it, I had no way of knowing how long I'd been walking. My legs ached, and my throat felt raw and parched despite rationing the water. I was down to the last few sips when I saw it, a faint light in the distance. Hope surged through me, giving me a burst of energy. I quickened my pace, the light growing brighter as I got closer. It was a small building, a gas station, or what used to be one. The windows were boarded up, and the sign was faded and missing letters. But there was a light, a single bulb glowing above the door. Someone had to be there. I stumbled up to the door and knocked, the sound echoing in the quiet night. "Hello? Is anyone here?" My voice cracked, but I didn't care. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, the door creaked open. The inside was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the bulb outside. Shelves stood empty, covered in dust and cobwebs. It smelled musty, like it hadn't been used in years. I called out again, but there was no response. My heart sank. Whoever had left the light on was long gone. I searched the place anyway, desperate for anything that might help. Most of the shelves were bare, but in the back, I found a dusty old vending machine. The glass was cracked, and the contents looked ancient, but I didn't care. I smashed the glass with a tire iron I'd picked up from the car, grabbing a couple of candy bars and a can of soda. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I sat on the floor, tearing into one of the candy bars like a wild animal. The sugar gave me a small burst of energy, enough to keep me going for a little while longer. I decided to rest there for the night. It wasn't safe to keep walking in the dark, and at least the building offered some shelter. The night passed slowly. I couldn't sleep, too on edge and too uncomfortable on the hard floor. Every creak and groan of the old building set my nerves on edge. But nothing happened. No one came. By morning, I felt worse than ever. My legs were stiff, my head pounded, and my throat was painfully dry. The soda had helped a little, but it wasn't enough. I needed water, and I needed it soon. I decided to keep walking. Staying at the gas station felt like giving up, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. The sun rose quickly, and with it came the heat. It wasn't long before I was drenched in sweat, my mouth so dry it hurt to swallow. I felt lightheaded, my steps unsteady. The road stretched on, and I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake. Maybe I should have stayed at the gas station, waited for help. But it was too late to turn back now. Just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I saw something in the distance. A truck. It was coming toward me, kicking up a cloud of dust as it rumbled down the road. I waved my arms frantically, stumbling into the middle of the road to make sure they saw me. The truck slowed, then stopped a few feet away. The driver leaned out the window, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and kind eyes. "You all right, miss?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. I nodded weakly, too exhausted to speak. He got out and helped me into the truck, offering me a bottle of water. I drank greedily, the cool liquid soothing my parched throat. "What are you doing out here all alone?" he asked as he climbed back into the driver's seat. I managed to explain what had happened, my voice hoarse and shaky. He listened patiently, nodding as I spoke. "You're lucky I came along," he said when I finished. "Not many people take this road anymore. Let's get you to the nearest town, get you some proper help." I leaned back in the seat, the weight of the past day finally lifting. For the first time since my car had broken down, I felt safe. As the truck rumbled down the road, I watched the desert landscape pass by, the sun blazing high in the sky. It wasn't over yet, but I knew I was going to be okay, and that was enough. The engine sputtered, and the car's tires kicked up the last of the gravel as I coasted to a stop. I glanced at the gas gauge, empty. Not the kind of empty where you have a little left, but the kind where the needle is below E and the light on the dashboard has been blinking for miles. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. I'd been driving for hours, lost in the middle of nowhere. Nothing but flat land in every direction and a faint smell of dampness in the air. I had no idea when I had taken the wrong turn. One minute I was on a well-paved road, the next I was on some forgotten stretch of highway with no signs of civilization. I wasn't even sure which direction I had come from or where I was heading. The GPS had given up hours ago, and my phone was showing no signal. I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour, and the trees and fields surrounding me seemed to stretch forever. The world felt too quiet, as if it was holding its breath. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs and wiping a bead of sweat from my forehead. The sun was starting to dip low, casting long shadows across the empty land. I knew I had to figure something out. I couldn't stay out here with nothing to go on. There was no gas station, no small town, not even a house in sight. Just the endless road and a few scraggly bushes clinging to life in the dry earth. I checked the trunk to see if I had anything that might help. A couple of water bottles, a blanket, and a flashlight. Not exactly survival gear, but better than nothing. I didn't know how far it was to the nearest town, but I knew I couldn't wait until dark. I had to make a decision: stay with the car and hope someone would pass by, or try walking. Neither option felt good, but the thought of sitting in the car, waiting to see if anyone noticed my stranded vehicle, seemed worse. The road was straight and empty, but I took a deep breath and started walking. The grass underfoot was dry and cracked in places, the earth parched from weeks without rain. My shoes kicked up small clouds of dust with every step. It felt like the kind of place that had no end, just endless stretches of dirt, cracked earth, and silence. After walking for what felt like hours, the sun had nearly set. The temperature had dropped significantly, and I could see my breath in the cool evening air. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet where you start to question if you're alone. The faint rustling of the wind through the dry grass was the only sound I could hear. The sense of isolation was suffocating. I hadn't seen a house or any kind of landmark, and I was starting to feel like I was losing my way. The road had begun to curve, and I couldn't tell if it was leading anywhere. I looked back over my shoulder. The car was a tiny dot now, barely visible in the distance. I had already walked farther than I had planned, and I knew I couldn't afford to keep going without a plan. I started to feel the first signs of panic. What if no one found me? What if I walked in the wrong direction? What if I was walking straight into more of nothing? I tried to push the thoughts aside and focus on putting one foot in front of the other, but it was getting harder to ignore the mounting anxiety in my chest. I stopped to catch my breath, wiping sweat from my forehead and rubbing my eyes. I took a long drink from one of the bottles I'd brought with me, hoping it would help me calm down. The road in front of me seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance, a dark line that faded into the horizon. Out of nowhere, I heard a sound. At first, I wasn't sure if it was real. I stood still, listening. It was faint but unmistakable, an engine. Car coming from behind me. Relief washed over me at the thought of being rescued. I turned around, half expecting a car to appear around the bend. But the road remained empty. My heart sank. Maybe I had imagined it. I strained my ears, but the sound was gone, leaving nothing but the silence. I didn't know whether to keep going or turn back. The feeling of being watched started creeping over me. I turned in circles, trying to make out any movement, any sign of life, but the land remained still. I tried to focus. Maybe I had heard the sound from a distance. Maybe it was just a truck passing through somewhere far off, and the wind had carried it toward me. But why couldn't I see anything? It didn't make sense. The sound had been clear. I'd been on this road long enough to know that nothing ever passed by. I started walking again, faster this time, as if my body could outrun the unease that had settled in my bones. My pulse quickened, and the hairs on my neck stood on end. I had the strangest feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was out there, watching me. The road was still empty, and the fading light of the sun made it harder to see. It was as if the world had shifted, like time itself had slowed down. Every step I took felt heavier, as though the air was thickening with tension. Then, without warning, the sound came again, this time closer. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Car was coming. I turned around, praying that I wasn't imagining it this time. There was no way I could get away fast enough if it was someone with bad intentions. I had no weapon, no way to protect myself. The engine grew louder, closer, until I could see the headlights in the distance, shining like twin beacons in the darkness. The relief that rushed over me was almost overwhelming, but something about the way the car was approaching felt wrong. It was too fast, too sudden, and there was something off about it. It came around the bend, a black SUV barreling down the road, too fast for the conditions. My stomach dropped. I wanted to wave to make sure they saw me, but something in the back of my mind told me to be careful. I stepped back off the road and into the grass, feeling my pulse race. The car slowed as it neared me, and for a moment, it seemed like it would just pass by. But then it stopped. The engine idled, and the headlights shone directly on me. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The driver didn't speak, didn't even roll down the window. I stood there, waiting for something to happen. I didn't know whether to approach or turn and run. The seconds felt like hours. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the window rolled down, and a voice called out, "Need a ride?" I hesitated. The voice was calm, but there was something in the way the man spoke that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the kind of offer you'd get from someone genuinely trying to help. There was an edge to it, a tone that made me question everything. I shook my head. "No, I'm fine. Just need some help with my car." The man didn't respond right away. The car's engine hummed softly, and I could feel his gaze on me, though I couldn't make out any details of his face in the darkness. Something felt wrong, so wrong, that I couldn't explain it. The silence dragged on for what felt like a lifetime. Finally, the man spoke again, his voice low. "If you're sure, but you're a long way from anywhere. You shouldn't be out here alone." "I'll be fine," I said, backing away, my instincts screaming at me to leave. "Thanks, but I'm good." The car idled for a moment longer. Then, without another word, the window rolled back up, and the SUV slowly pulled away, disappearing into the night. I stood there, frozen, watching the taillights fade into the darkness. I didn't wait. I didn't look back. I turned and started walking in the opposite direction, my legs shaky beneath me, my mind racing. I didn't know who that man was or why he had stopped, but I knew one thing for sure. I had made the right choice not accepting his offer. The air felt thick with danger, and I had no intentions of finding out what he had in mind. It wasn't until I finally saw a distant light flickering ahead, a sign of civilization, that I let myself believe I might make it out of there. It was still miles away, but it was something, a chance. By the time I made it to the small gas station, I was shaking from exhaustion and relief. I didn't look back once, and I never found out who that man was or what his intentions were. But I did make it. I did get out, and I never took the road less traveled again. It's funny how easily people can get lost, even when they think they know exactly where they're going. I've heard people talk about it all the time. "I'll just take this shortcut," they say. "It's faster, it'll save me time." What they don't realize is that shortcuts often lead to unexpected places, and not always the ones you'd want to find. I never thought it would happen to me, though. I mean, I'm not the type of person who gets lost. I'm a practical guy. I've done a lot of traveling, road trips, camping, hiking, and I'm good with directions. Or at least I thought I was. The whole thing started when I decided to take a different route home from work one night. It was late, maybe around 10 p.m., and I was tired. My usual route was always the same. The highway to the main road, past the gas station, then a right turn onto a small country road that would take me home. That night, though, something told me to try a shortcut. Maybe I was too eager to get home. Maybe it was because I'd seen a sign for a new road that promised a faster route, or maybe it was just a whim. Whatever the reason, I ignored my instincts and turned onto the new road. At first, everything seemed fine. The road was narrow but well paved, and there was barely any traffic. I passed a few houses, some old barns, and a couple of rusted cars parked in front of weather-beaten trailers. Everything seemed pretty normal for the middle of nowhere. The air was crisp, and the quiet of the night was unsettling in a way that made my skin prickle. But I didn't think much of it. After all, I'd been on roads like this before. I drove for what felt like an hour. The farther I went, the more the road twisted and turned, narrowing and fading into a gravel path. I noticed how much darker it was out here. There were no streetlights, no signs of life. Just me, my car, and the headlights slicing through the blackness. A few trees leaned over the road, their branches making eerie shadows that danced in front of my headlights. It didn't bother me at first. I figured the road would open up again soon, like every other shortcut I'd taken in the past. But the more I drove, the more I realized this wasn't just a shortcut. It was an isolated path leading somewhere far from civilization. I checked my phone. No service. Of course, I always forget that out here the signal's spotty at best and non-existent at worst. But it wasn't a big deal. I had enough gas. I knew the general direction of where I was headed, and there was no reason to think anything could go wrong. Then I saw it. A turnoff just ahead. It wasn't marked by any sign, and the road looked even more overgrown than the one I had been on. A small wooden post stuck out from the grass, half-rotted and barely noticeable in the dark. But something about it caught my eye. It seemed off. A chill ran through me as I slowed the car and approached it. The road curved, and I could just make out a small trail leading into the trees. The kind of trail that no one ever uses anymore. The kind that seemed almost like it was begging not to be followed. I don't know what made me do it, but I turned onto that road. I kept driving slowly, hoping that I'd find a clearing or something to break the dense woods surrounding me. The trees closed in tighter as I went on, their branches nearly touching my windshield. It was suffocating. The air felt heavier here, thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. The silence was almost too quiet, if that makes sense. There wasn't a sound. No animals, no wind rustling through the leaves. Nothing. I should have turned back, but I didn't. The road didn't seem like a road at all anymore. It was more of a rough path, a muddy trail that could barely fit my car. The headlights flickered a few times as I hit potholes and uneven patches of dirt. The further I went, the more it felt like the world around me was closing in. There was no sign of life, no houses, no barns, nothing. Just trees and shadows. And then I saw it. A house. It was small, old, and crooked. The kind of house you'd expect to find in a horror story. Run down with peeling paint and sagging walls. It sat just off the road, hidden by thick bushes and trees. There was no driveway, no signs of activity, just this abandoned-looking place in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't understand why anyone would live out here, let alone build a house like that. I pulled over and sat there, staring at it for a few moments, unsure of what to do. The air was thick with an unsettling calmness. Something felt wrong about this place, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I thought about just driving away, but I was too curious. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be behind that house. Maybe it was just some forgotten relic of the past. Maybe it had an interesting history. Maybe it was just abandoned. But even that seemed strange in a place this remote. Eventually, I decided to take a quick look. What harm could it do? It was late, but I wasn't too far from civilization. I could always turn around if I felt uneasy. I locked my car, grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, and started walking toward the house. The closer I got, the more I could make out. The roof was half collapsed, the windows boarded up, and the door sagged on its hinges. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, maybe decades. Still, I had to know. I had to see it up close. I pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the silence. Inside, it was dark, but the flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing dust-covered furniture, broken glass, and what appeared to be old papers scattered across the floor. It looked like someone had lived there at some point, but they'd left a long time ago. There was no sign of life, no fresh footprints, no indication that anyone had been there recently. And then I saw it, a photo partially hidden under a pile of debris. I bent down to pick it up, and as I did, my stomach turned. The photo was old, faded, and yellowed with age. It showed a family, man, woman, and 2 kids. They looked happy, smiling in front of the house, but there was something off about their eyes. Their faces seemed too blank, too empty. I stood up, holding the photo in my hand. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I heard a faint sound, a rustling noise from behind me. I froze. I turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Nothing. But then I heard it again, a soft thump, like something heavy being moved, coming from upstairs. I don't know why I didn't run at that moment. Maybe it was just shock. Maybe I was too curious. Whatever it was, I stood there for a few more seconds, trying to convince myself that it was just the house settling, that it was nothing. But then I heard it again, a louder thump, and then another. It was coming from above me from the 2nd floor. That was when my instincts kicked in. I didn't even think. I turned and bolted out of the house. My heart was pounding as I ran back to my car, hands shaking as I fumbled to open the door. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, gasping for air. I could feel my pulse in my neck, my whole body tense with adrenaline. I started the engine and peeled out of there, kicking up gravel as I sped down the path, my headlights bouncing wildly through the trees. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, miles away from that house. I never went back, and I never spoke about it to anyone. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed just a little longer. If I'd gone upstairs. What did I hear? Was it just the house? Or something or someone else? I'll never know, and I'm okay with that. I had no idea how I ended up here. The road seemed to stretch on forever, endless and empty. My car's engine hummed quietly as I drove, the only sound in the otherwise silent night. It had been hours since I'd seen any sign of civilization, and all I had was a vague sense of direction to guide me. The GPS had died miles back, and I hadn't seen a gas station or a diner since then. Just endless, flat land with the occasional tree or fence post. The kind of place where you feel the isolation seeping into your bones. I had been driving for work, just trying to get to a small town for a project I was supposed to help with. The details were vague, but the pay was decent, so I agreed. Now, it seemed like a terrible mistake. The road signs had stopped making sense hours ago, and I was starting to wonder if I'd even make it to the town at all. The only light came from the headlights of my car, and the occasional flicker of a distant, dying streetlight. The night felt oppressive. It was like the darkness had weight, pressing down on me. There was something off about the way the landscape never changed. Flat and unchanging, a vast desert of nothingness. I glanced at the fuel gauge. It was on empty. Great, just great. I pulled over to the side of the road, hoping to spot some sign of life. No lights, no buildings, just the occasional silhouette of a tree, tall and skeletal against the dark sky. I stepped out of the car, feeling the cold air bite at my skin. The night was too quiet. There should have been some sound, an animal, a breeze, anything. But there was nothing, not a single noise. I checked the map on my phone, but it was useless now, just a blank screen. The battery was dead too. I cursed under my breath. I could try to walk, but where to? There was no obvious direction. No sign of a road or a town anywhere. I thought about staying in the car, but with the fuel running low, that didn't seem like a great idea either. I stood there for a moment, staring at the dark horizon. A feeling of unease settled in my stomach. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just the isolation, it was something else. A prickling sensation at the back of my neck, as if I were being watched. I shook the thought away, not wanting to dwell on it, but the air felt thicker now, heavier. I turned to get back in the car, but before I could, I saw something, movement on the side of the road, a shadow darting behind a tree, or maybe it was just the wind. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't want to investigate. I really didn't, but the feeling in my gut told me to. It felt like something I couldn't ignore, like my body was already reacting before my brain could catch up. I stepped toward the shadow, my footsteps almost soundless on the gravel. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the branches above me. I reached the tree, and there was nothing there, just the gnarled trunk and a few low-hanging branches. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the area around me. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath and turned back to the car, trying to convince myself it was just my nerves getting the best of me. But when I reached for the door handle, I froze. It was open, the car door wide open like someone had been inside. I knew I had locked it when I got out. I always lock my doors. Always. My heart raced. I stepped forward cautiously, peering inside the car. The seats were empty. Nothing seemed out of place. but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something had been there, something or someone. I backed away from the car slowly, my breath shallow. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced through options, but nothing felt right. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, with no way of getting help, and I was starting to feel like I wasn't the only one here. I looked around again, scanning the horizon for anything that could give me some sense of direction or safety. The darkness felt deeper now, more oppressive, as if it were closing in on me. I thought I saw something, a figure, standing at the edge of the road, just beyond the reach of my headlights. But when I blinked, it was gone. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. This couldn't be real. My mind was playing tricks on me. The isolation, the silence, it was messing with my head. I needed to get out of there, fast. I ran back to the car, jumping in and slamming the door shut. My hands were trembling as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered and groaned, but it started. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I put the car into gear and pressed the gas pedal down, my tires kicking up gravel as I drove faster. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, that I wasn't alone anymore. The road ahead was still empty, stretching endlessly into the dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I kept glancing in the mirror, checking for any signs of movement. I told myself it was just paranoia, but the sensation wouldn't go away. The headlights flickered briefly, and I swore I saw something in the distance, a shape moving on the side of the road. But when I blinked, it was gone again. I slammed my foot on the gas, pushing the car harder. The road seemed to twist, the landscape shifting in ways that didn't make sense. I had to be close to a town, right? The thought of just finding a small town, a gas station, anything to feel like I was no longer trapped in this void of nothingness, kept me going. And then, in the distance, I saw lights, real lights, a sign of civilization. Relief flooded over me. I didn't care how far off it was. I would drive straight to it, no matter what. I pushed the car to its limits, the engine roaring as I sped toward the lights. The feeling of being followed, of being watched, faded as I focused on the road ahead, desperate for the safety of the town. I passed a few abandoned buildings, but then I saw the town itself, small, quiet, but real. As I entered the outskirts, the lights from street lamps felt like a warm embrace. I slowed down, my hands still shaking as I passed the first few houses. I found a small diner on the corner of a street and pulled into the parking lot, my heart still racing. I cut the engine and sat there for a moment, just breathing, trying to collect myself. The night had been unnerving, but now that I was here, everything felt a little more normal. I got out of the car, my legs unsteady as I walked toward the diner. I needed a cup of coffee, something to steady my nerves. I stepped inside, the bell above the door ringing as I entered. The diner was quiet, just a few people scattered at tables, all of them looking tired or lost in their own thoughts. I sat down at the counter, the waitress walking over with a tired smile. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice friendly, if not a little weary. I ordered coffee, my voice still a little shaky. She nodded and disappeared behind the counter. As I waited, I glanced out the window. The road outside seemed like nothing more than a stretch of pavement now, leading into the town, nothing unusual about it. No dark figures, no shadows lurking, just the soft glow of streetlights. It had to have been my imagination. The isolation, the exhaustion, the darkness, all of it had played tricks on me. I wasn't being followed. There was nothing out there. But then, as I looked closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing at the edge of the parking lot. It wasn't clear at first, just a silhouette, but the longer I looked, the clearer it became. Someone was watching the diner. Someone was still out there. I quickly turned my gaze back to the counter, trying to steady my breathing. I had to focus on the present, not the lingering terror of the night. The waitress came back with my coffee, setting the mug down in front of me. "Here you go," she said, her voice warm. I nodded, forcing a smile, but I couldn't help the shiver that ran down my spine. Whatever was out there, whatever had been following me, wasn't going away. It wasn't over, but for now I was safe. I was in the town with people, and for the first time all night, I could breathe without feeling like the darkness was closing in. I took a sip of the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through me. It wasn't over, but at least for now, I was no longer alone. I remember the moment when I first realized I was lost. I had been hiking through the woods for hours, the same trail I'd followed many times before. But that was before the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the path. It wasn't until the light began to fade that I realized just how quiet everything had become. The usual rustle of leaves, the chirps of birds, gone. It was as if the woods had held their breath. And then the smell of the air changed. It wasn't the fresh, pine-scented breeze I was used to. No, this one had a mustiness to it, almost like wet dirt and mold. I checked my watch, 6:30 p.m. The sun was setting fast, and the path, which had once been clear, was starting to look unfamiliar. I'd hiked this trail so many times I could do it in my sleep, but now it was like I was walking through a different forest altogether. I pulled out my map. The screen was cracked, but it still worked, albeit with some difficulty. I traced my finger over the trail that should have led me straight back to the parking lot. But the more I looked at the map, the more confused I became. I had seen this trailhead earlier in the day, but now I wasn't sure where it was anymore. The trees looked different, more clustered, and the ground underfoot felt softer than usual. I started walking faster, my boots crunching against the dry leaves that covered the ground. Maybe I had taken a wrong turn, or maybe the trail had been altered, and I hadn't noticed. But I had to get out of here. The night was coming on quickly, and the last thing I wanted was to be stuck out here in the dark. The silence was unnerving. I tried to focus on the crunching of my steps, but even that seemed to fade after a while. It wasn't until I heard a snap of a twig somewhere behind me that I froze. My heart rate spiked. I looked over my shoulder, but saw nothing. Just trees, stretching out in all directions. I shook it off, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then, I heard it again, louder this time. A definite snap of a branch, followed by a rustle in the underbrush. My breath caught in my throat. There was something else out there. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too human. I quickened my pace, trying not to panic. Every crack of the branches, every rustle of leaves made my stomach churn. The hairs on my neck were standing on end, but I couldn't see anything. My mind was starting to play tricks on me. I told myself. It had to be the dark playing its part, the shadows stretching and shifting, making ordinary things seem more sinister. But the more I walked, the more the sensation of being watched grew. It was like someone or something was trailing just behind me, staying out of my line of sight. I glanced at the trees, hoping to catch a glimpse of something that would explain the unease crawling under my skin, but there was nothing. I needed to make it out. I pushed myself forward, but every step seemed to take longer. The trail was growing thinner, the trees closer together. The path was no longer marked with the familiar yellow arrows on the trees that I had been following earlier. The woods were changing. I was changing with them. My breathing became shallow, my mind spinning with all the possible explanations. Maybe I had taken a wrong turn. Maybe I had circled back and didn't even know it. I stopped to catch my breath, scanning the woods for any sign of where I was or where I should go. My phone was dead, the battery drained earlier in the day. The map on my phone, which had once felt like a safety net, was useless now. I pulled it out anyway, squinting at the cracked screen. Nothing. The path didn't match up with the map anymore. Panic began to settle in, and I cursed myself for not taking a better look before the sun started to set. But that didn't help now. What was worse than being lost was knowing that I wasn't alone out here. The feeling of being watched had not dissipated. I could still hear the faint rustling behind me, but I couldn't turn around. I couldn't let whatever it was know that I was afraid. I kept walking, my legs aching, my pace slower, more deliberate. The trees around me were starting to twist in strange ways, their branches reaching out like claws. It was as though the forest was closing in, trapping me. The darkness was overwhelming now. The last vestiges of sunlight had disappeared completely, leaving only the pale, ghostly light of the moon to illuminate the trail ahead. The shadows were deep, and the forest had taken on a sinister quality. I could barely make out the path now, and each step felt like a small victory. But every noise, every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves, made my heart race. I heard footsteps behind me. I froze again. These were different from the sounds I'd been hearing before. This time it was too deliberate, too real. Someone was following me. The panic surged and I ran. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I ran as fast as I could, ignoring the branches that slapped at my face and the roots that twisted underfoot. I didn't stop. Couldn't. My mind was screaming at me to get out, to keep running. Every instinct in my body told me that if I stopped, if I slowed down, I wouldn't make it out of the woods. The forest seemed endless. The more I ran, the more I realized I had no idea where I was. The trail had disappeared. I was running through the woods, lost with something or someone, right behind me. Then I stumbled. My foot caught on a root and I fell forward, hitting the ground hard. My palms scraped against the dirt and my knees slammed into the ground. I gasped for air, my chest heaving. I could hear the footsteps behind me now, close, too close. I scrambled to my feet, but my legs felt like lead. I couldn't move fast enough. I had to get away. There was a crack, and suddenly I felt a hand on my shoulder. My heart stopped. I spun around, fists raised, but there was no one there, just empty space. I stood there, gasping for breath, staring into the darkness. The woods around me seemed to pulse, alive, as if they were watching me. I could feel it. I could hear it, the sound of someone or something moving in the shadows. But then, a strange calmness washed over me. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The fear that had gripped me seemed to loosen its hold. I stood there for a moment, eyes wide, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the cold metal of my keys. With a sense of clarity I hadn't felt since I'd first started this hike, I made a decision. I had to get to the road. If I could make it to the road, I could find my way back. I began walking slowly at first, then picking up the pace. The sounds that had haunted me earlier were gone, replaced by the soft rustling of the wind in the trees. The night was still, the moonlight now casting long shadows on the ground. The tension in my chest eased with every step I took, and after what felt like an eternity, I finally saw it, a break in the trees. I stepped through the trees and onto the gravel road. The familiar sound of tires crunching over the stones was the most comforting thing I had ever heard. I had made it out. The walk back to my car was quiet, and when I reached it, I didn't hesitate to get in and drive. I didn't even look back at the woods. It wasn't until I was safely home, sitting on my couch, that I realized what had happened. I had been followed, not by an animal, not by a ghost or some mythical creature, but by someone. I don't know who it was or why they were out there. I don't know if they ever meant me harm. But what I do know is this: some part of me had to face the truth. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't the unknown or the supernatural. It's the fact that Even in the middle of nowhere, you're never truly alone.